the political negotiations. And there was drama. Each of us through our different countries are getting WhatsApp messages that are saying, okay, the negotiations are breaking down completely. South Africa was standing its ground on wanting to have the institutionalization, and others within the system did not necessarily want that.
Others?
What I'm seeing right now and the way that it actually goes, the man is the one that is ruling all of it.
Welcome back to Palatable Politics, a show where we make politics palatable. With me, your host, TJ Maslela. Welcome to the show. In this session, we've got a guest who has participated in Y20, G20, who has been in the limelight since she was a teenager, first African face of Nickelodeon, and an activist at large, entrepreneur too. It's a mouthful for someone who is only 23, right? Our guest, Miss Lerai. Welcome to the show.
Hi TJ, how are you?
I'm good. A bit anxious. I don't know what to expect. But I'm excited.
I'm happy to be here. I'm a fan of the podcast. I've been following it for a bit. Some of the people that you've had on the show, I've had an opportunity to work with. So it's always great to see familiar faces. I'm glad that I was chosen.
I mean, the work you've done is inspiring. So with that said, what is it you do and how did you get into it?
So I always categorize myself under 3 pillars purely because I am a multi-hyphenate human being. As all of us are, I've just been able to, I guess, put a label on that. So pillar 1 is creative entrepreneur, which you sort of touched on. It's the presenter me, it's the producer me, it's the writer me, whose work is award-winning. I have a company.
Congrats.
Thank you. I'm a co-director of a company called African Talent Unearthed. Myself and my mother are business partners, and we started the company when I was still in primary school. In 2015, I think we took kids from Zimbabwe to Los Angeles for the World Championships of Performing Arts, which is essentially like the Olympics for performing arts. And that was sort of where it started. It was a business idea that came from my mother being a mother and watching me participate in ISTEDFord and South African Championships of Performing Arts. And her being an entrepreneur, coming from an entrepreneurial family, said, you know what, Lerai, let's start this thing. We can take this model and actually empower other Africans apart from, just our country. But also because loosely we do have roots in Zimbabwe. I'm probably only based off of my heritage, I think I'm probably only 25% South African, but I was born here. My whole family is South African. We'll get into that a little bit, but it's the identity politics.
I've seen you talk about it, but yes, we are coming to it.
Of being a South African. So that's where the company started. It's now the vehicle that manages myself as a talent, but also the projects that I have. Things like Tune In, which was a stage production that I premiered at Cotton Fest in front of over 11,000 people in the audience. It was an ode to youth culture and its intersection with music. That's also something that comes from me getting a bit deeper into my family history. But essentially, we went through 5 eras of South African music, from kwaito to house to hip hop to piano, and just making it something really fun, but capturing how youth culture really is, or rather, what the zeitgeist is, youth culture converging with music. So that's creative entrepreneur, and there's a bunch of other projects that I've worked on that I am working on. And then I'm also a conversation strategist, professional speaker, moderator. That's the pillar that's enabled me to do things like be a keynote speaker for the International Cricket Council, for
the National
Dialogue, the convention of the National Dialogue,
yes,
co-program directing with Ms. Teto, as well as just, a few other spaces and stages that one may have seen me on. And then really where my passion sits is, so it's creative entrepreneur, conversation strategist, and social change maker is number 3, which is passion and purpose meeting together and sort of using the other 2 pillars as a vehicle to find change. That is what I do.
And in terms of who you are, 25% South African, explain.
Okay, so it would be first important to start off by saying that I was raised by a single mother. And so the side of my family that I connect with, that I was raised with, was my mother's side. And that's what I have a deeper understanding. But I must acknowledge the fact that my father is Sotho. And so, under technicalities, I am a Sotho South African woman. Now, when it comes to cultural identity, my mother is from a mixed family, mixed race, mixed cultures, all of that. My mother's grandmother was an Italian woman who was raised in KwaZulu-Natal, and her grandfather was a Shona man who came from Rusape. He was, I guess, running away from becoming a chief or something like that. But they came to Johannesburg. Both of them had their own separate paths, which each have their own beautiful stories that I think a lot of not only South Africans, but Africans can relate to. And they then got married and set up shop in South Africa. In Doornfontein, they had a restaurant called Michael's, which just before we were forcibly removed from certain areas and put into townships, it was a thriving business, a place where even a young lawyer by the name of Nelson Mandela would regularly have his lunch there. So those were sort of the circles that my great-grandparents, my mother's grandparents, moved in. And then as history goes, they were moved to Soweto. And we were in Orlando West particularly, which is, if you, do you know anything about Soweto? Where are you from?
No, I'm from here.
You're from Joburg?
I grew up in Pretoria.
Pretoria, okay.
Yeah, Pretoria and Nelspruit, yeah.
Pretoria and Nelspruit. So Jozi, Soweto, that's like, that's Ikaslam Lelo. And that's because of where I come from. Now, my grandparents, so their kids, will call... So the mixed race couple then had children. They had about 9 children, so a big family, which, because they were mixed race, some were colored presenting and some looked perhaps a bit darker skin tone than myself. So the 2 oldest sons, or other siblings, Lucky and Leo, changed their surname from Tandy, which was our family surname, to Michael's after their father's actual name. And that was because they used to call my great-grandfather Mr. Michael's because his restaurant was called Michael's. Now just sort of think about, notoriety within a certain community. And then those siblings started the first ever nightclub in Soweto called Club Pelican. This was, to those that know, an incredibly iconic space. It was a space where a 13-year-old Lebu M had the opportunity to play in a band for the first time with my grandparents as the curators and owners of the space. Lebu M, as we all know, then went to go and create the musical score for The Lion King. Kgalema Motlanthe was, former president of South Africa, Honorable Kgalema Motlanthe, was a young man also playing around in that space. Anybody that was in, and the people that we call the legends of the South African entertainment industry, all passed through that space. People like Mary Twala were entertaining people there regularly. And so this really was a cultural hotspot at a time where Black people were not necessarily allowed to have that agency. And as obviously because of the political climate and the social climate of the time, and looking at the geographic positioning of Orlando West, this was directly, to those that know the sort of makeup, directly, like where the club was about 100 meters away from where Orlando Stadium is right now, and right in front of the train station. So in terms of just getting to the space, it was incredibly accessible. And this is also like a block away from Vilakazi Street. The street that Club Pelican is on is Pella Street, where the Hector Peterson Museum is, right up the road. So, sorry, I know you want to say something, but I'm just sort of painting the picture of being in this area. This is the same area where the June 16 uprisings happened. The club was open from, I think, the late 60s up until the 80s. And so if all of this political action is taking place, this is the space where underground political meetings are also taking place. And so my grandfather, Lucky Michaels, and his siblings, because they all ran the club together, but of course he was the face of the space. They were, Lucky was, because there was a ban on alcohol or a prohibition for Black people, he also played in the activism space as well. As much as he owned a club, he was also, a prominent activist in the space as well, in the sense that I can go and search newspaper clippings of the Rand Daily Mail or the Citizen.
And this is where your activism came in.
This is me only in my adult life or young adult life, understanding deeply about my family. Now, I had heard stories about them, but because, remember, single mother, that really was my family. And of course, I had my grandparents, but these were stories that I heard about. Now being, once I actually started university, having access to journal archives, being able to actually go into those archives, I started to uncover my own family history and sort of piece it all together, piece the stories that I had heard all together.
And so this is activism and youth coming in. How did you get involved with the Y20 and co-chairing that?
Okay. So now
what is the Y20?
Okay. So now that we know sort of, I think this is now an uncovering of me in my early 20s. Really, I still am in my early 20s. So it's like in the past 3 years or so, I realized that I have had not only an innate passion for wanting to make some sort of change, I realized that this was also something that happened in my family. It's in my bloodline as well. Being part of the media, being part of entertainment, as well as being part of politics in some way, shape or form. Now, the Y20 came about, which was I had been wanting to find ways to get involved and not having the vocabulary. I first started when I was in high school. I joined a club called Girl Up Johannesburg. And this was sort of just me as a young person trying to figure out, how can I make meaningful change? And that also comes from not only my family history, but my own interaction with the law, with service delivery, and sort of having been failed by the system in some way, which we can get into that a little bit later on in the conversation. And so it was first joining Girl Up Johannesburg, which is a women, or rather adolescent female organization that is housed under the United Nations Foundation, which essentially allows any group of girls, whether it's in a school, whether it's in a religious community, whatever community it is, you start your own Girl Up Club and they give you the kit of everything that you need, and you can use that as your vehicle for advocacy. So that was my first time. And then when I was in my final year of high school, this was also COVID, my friends and I started an organization, or rather a campaign called 1000 Girls Johannesburg. 1000 Girls campaign. And this was because we realized that there was a group of people that were displaced in Johannesburg during the whole COVID-19 situation. It was refugees. So many people come to our country seeking refuge, but at that time we were seeing these news headlines of, refugees even being kicked out of churches, just, spaces where they were just displaced. They've been displaced from their own countries and now coming to a place seeking refuge. And so we were like, okay, how can we find, or rather use, whatever resources are available to us? Okay, we have schools, we can mobilize our peers, we can mobilize our social media communities to sort of make a change. And we raised funds to get hygiene and sanitary packages for 1,000 women and girl children within Johannesburg that were refugees. I then am just sort of finding a way to...
This is still the part to Y20.
This is, now we're getting to Y20. So now I had, because Y20 comes after a few failures of me trying to get into, last year it was BRICS. There was a call for applications for young people to join, made the application, didn't hear back. There was also COP17 that I had tried to get into. And so all of these are calls for applications that these organizations put out to sort of have young people engage. Eventually, I strike gold. I put an application, responded to the call that Y20 had put out. And that's because I just constantly follow whatever these organizations are doing. I had heard from last year that South Africa has the G20 presidency coming. I was like, okay, there's going to be an opportunity for young people to get involved. And so even with Y20, I had, or in my first capacity, I was asked to be part, or I was accepted to be part of the technical task force.
Okay.
And I'm somebody who sort of forestellas to put myself in positions. And that's just because people can look at you, especially being a young person, right? You may not have the CV that is vast enough that can actually say people, or rather indicates to people which position you should be put into. And I've oftentimes found myself where, as long as I've just had my foot in the door, I can put my hand up and say, no, I actually have these skills, I can do this, I can not do that, And so it was just before the launch of the Y20, which I hadn't actually had a proper position in the Y20 apart from just being accepted to be part of the technical task force. I had applied to then come to the launch, and the response that I got was, okay, you can come and join the online thing. But I was like, that's not where I want to be. I don't want to join the launch online. I want to be in the room with the people so I can talk to whoever I need to talk to, sort of see how can I get involved? How can I use whatever passion I have, whatever skills I have to just meaningfully engage in this thing that you guys are putting together? But also, what is this thing that you guys are putting together? So I get there to the launch, and I have my own platform, Ride Talks, where I do something similar to what you guys do here. And I was just sort of covering what is this Y20 thing, because the information around it wasn't exactly clear. And I was like, you can't go through the traditional avenues to find out something. Sometimes you have to just make sure that you are in the space, that you find the people that are in charge and you ask them the right questions. And so I did that, and I find the people who make up the secretariat of the Y20, and I'm sort of asking them, guys, what's going on with this thing, They were still a little bit unsure of the process and sort of how it was going. And I later on learn is because that the Y20, having been the oldest engagement group within the G20, it's about 10 years old, is not institutionalized. So that meant that as much as the G20 presidency was handed over to South Africa in November, it still meant that a group of young people had to organize themselves and say, okay, we will take up the mantle to do this thing. That wasn't mandated by DIRCO yet. And so this was a group of young people who were already part of their own civic organizations coming together, who then made up the secretariat. Those are the people that are my leaders, the people that you see at the face of Y20, And they have then come together and they've said, okay, we're still figuring it out ourselves as well. And so this is, I think, about April, May of this year. So the process had already sort of, they'd lost a bit of time, but that's because the organization itself wasn't an organization. And so they have to first organize themselves as young people. And then under the Troika model, which is the previous presidency, the current presidency, and the future presidency, then figure out from Brazil, what did they do? And they have to then start to put together their own website. They put together their social media pages, such and such. Then they make the call to young people, which is the part that I found myself in. That's where I find myself in the whole situation.
And then the work of the task team. I know in one of the things you posted, could have been Right Talks, that the importance of agenda setting. Can you walk us through that and the role that the Y20 played in that?
Okay. So the Y20 then eventually, when they have organized themselves, which I think we definitely need to commend that group of young people that did do that, because you have a system, or rather there isn't a system. So the circumstances are working against you, and you sort of guerrilla style have to put something together. And so what they did was adopting from what already the G20 agenda was, which was sustainability. I'm forgetting the other two, but they sort of adopted that.
In
equality
and solidarity.
And solidarity, there you go. And so sustainability, equality, and solidarity, yes. And so they adopt that and they form 5 thematic areas. I was part of number 4. Yes, so they realized that, okay, in order for us to achieve these 3 things, we need to address 5 thematic areas. One of them was around AI. One of them was around social sustainability. I'm forgetting the others because we didn't have time to engross ourselves in the entire system. Okay. It was just sort of because we had such little time. And I found out that I was then made a track co-chair on the Friday. We had to start negotiating on the Monday. And so I literally had a weekend, and all of us as track coaches had to, over the one weekend, figure out what is this multilateral process? How do we ensure that we are, putting together, or rather chairing negotiations under a system that we didn't really understand. And so I will also then commend my co-chairs for, in literally 2 days, figuring it out without also having too much one-on-one time with our leadership, because they were also preoccupied with, with the bigger scheme of things. So I am now then put under track 4, which is meaningful youth engagement and reforming multilateralism.
And then how do you go about the engaging of youth to get there?
So then, now that there has been, so in the same way that there was a call about a month prior for applications, there also was a call for delegates. So they had at least already put together a group of South African delegates that would sit under the 5 thematic areas, as well as the rest of the G20 countries, or rather the G20 states plus the AU, putting together their own delegations. We then start our negotiation process online. Now, the people that are negotiating, the delegates that they have selected, are all incredibly capable, learned groups of young people that have sort of played in the multilateral space in some shape, way, or form, or received some form of training, whether that is through their, university training or being part of organizations beyond that. And so what our job was as coaches was to make sure that we are following the agenda that has been set by the Y20 to sort of make sure that we reach a consensus. So step 1 of the process was to hear each of the delegates out into saying, okay, what is the agenda under meaningful youth engagement and reforming multilateralism? What are the things that we need to see come out? Okay, so we then start talking about accountability mechanisms. We then start to talk about real meaningful engagement of young people as opposed to just youth tokenism. And I can't disclose too much about what happens in those discussions, but it was sort of around that. And then we start, amongst ourselves, sort of debating which accountability mechanisms are the best to choose from, and one of the ones that I sort of favored but couldn't necessarily raise, because I'm just a moderator, I'm just chairing negotiations, but was the APRM, African Peer Review Mechanism, which sits under the African Union. And so we found ourselves sort of negotiating, finding which existing measurement systems, which existing, just a whole bunch of stuff. There was a whole array of things that already exist, and how can we ensure that we actually find ways to achieve what our shared goals were, which was meaningful youth engagement and a reformed multilateral space, right? Things like reformation of the Security Council, of the, just the United Nations system, and so much more. We then have to go through a process of consensus building, because the G20 is not one where you can vote in the space. You have to all agree on something before it can actually be passed.
Like all, or because I know President said majority consensus.
Everybody has to agree.
Okay.
Consensus means that we are all agreeing. If one person doesn't want something to be passed, they redline it. It means that we have to go back to the drawing table and find a different word. So what our role was more so around the technical languaging of the policies, or rather the suggestions that the Y20 wanted to put forward. We then so we had a pre-summit, and then we have a final summit in August, where we've had, I think by that point, we'd had about 3 months of negotiations that took place. So we did have quite a bit of time of negotiating online. And it then gets to the level of the Sherpas at the summit, where they have the political negotiations. And there was drama. Okay. Because we have now gone through all this time of reaching consensus. There are red lines. We find different ways to work around that. But one of the main things that our South African presidency was advocating for was to have an institutionalization of the Y20. So that in the same way that the G20 is an institution, there is a social media, there is a website that is already existing. It is just handed over through the Troika model. So the Troika leadership model, it is just then handed over to the next leadership. But that means that they have institutional memory. You are able to go into the archives of all of the communiques that have been passed and all of that. Y20 doesn't have that. And so do the rest of the other engagement groups that sit under the G20.
Which ones did?
None.
Okay.
None are institutionalized.
Okay.
It's so what happens is that essentially each year under the G20 presidency, these engagement groups like the B20 that you've been part of, T20, Y20, there's Women 20, all of these engagement groups, which are essentially social engagement groups, so that the people have a say in what recommendations we want to put forward to the G20 leaders when they have their negotiations and then when they convene at their summit, which recently took place. And so we realized it was an incredibly big problem, and that's why South Africa's under our Y20 presidency said that no, we need to have some institutional memory. It empowers us to actually have a track record to look at how many of these communiques and these suggestions have been implemented, have not been implemented. You need an institution that says that you can actually trace things, so that you can see the successes, you can see the failures, but also that when the next presidency takes it over, they're not starting from scratch. But what happens currently is that each presidency has to start from scratch.
Okay, so you guys came up with the process, figured it out, props.
Yes.
Had the engagements, picked the delegates, and now the document that actually was a document that was submitted to the G20.
So we are now on our final day of negotiations at the summit. And we are all, I think it was our final
This is the one in August.
Sorry, in August, the final Y20 summit in August. And so I think it was our closing party, but the Sherpas were all hard at work, still negotiating. And we then, each of us through our different countries, are getting WhatsApp messages that are saying, okay, the negotiations are breaking down completely. Which is because South Africa was standing its ground on wanting to have the institutionalization, and others within the system did not necessarily want that.
Others?
I'm not going to.
It's worth a try.
We have to be politically correct here. We can't out people. But if you follow the G20 process, and if you follow sort of what the foreign policies are of certain states that are within the G20, you can sort of put two and two together to understand what their agendas are. Okay. But I think what the biggest thing with that was not necessarily that they didn't want a reform to multilateralism, a reform to the Y20 system. It was more so how the process went. So we found ourselves in a situation where the South African Y20 presidency was advocating for something that would change the circumstances under which we found ourselves. And that also means that the Brazil presidency found itself in that same situation. The United States presidency will probably find itself under that same situation. And so it was a call to a change, a call for a change to that. However, because of the actual political process, I have to be very careful with my. Please forgive me, but I have to be very. Yeah. Because of the process in itself, it's sort of like that in itself was going against what they were calling for. And so what we found ourselves then at the end of the week of negotiations was the goal of having a final communiqué, which we had about 3 drafts by then. So we started with our 0 draft. We had 3 drafts of a communiqué that were already put together. But because negotiations broke down, it meant that consensus could not be reached. And so our Y20 presidency came out without a communiqué, which meant that all of those months of negotiations, I won't necessarily say that they had, that they were for nothing, because we still had, it's about the people you meet along the way, the friends you make along the way,
experience,
right?
Relations.
The experience, the relationships that we built. And what came out of the Y20 was the chair's summary, which still had elements that were taken out of the previous drafts that we had, but it couldn't be passed as a communiqué because the final negotiation political level, which was at the Sherpa level, in the same way that the G20 has the Sherpas who are negotiating under the Sherpa track. And so these youth engagement groups all sit under the Sherpa track. We couldn't have that. And so I will commend the Y20 presidency on standing its ground for something that we all believed in. But it's a bit of a disappointment. And I think that in itself and the process and how it broke down is testament to really what is going on in the multilateral space. Because the G20 itself had similar elements to what we had within our own negotiations. And so it really shows that everything that we were advocating for under reforming multilateralism specifically, which was the track that I was co-chairing, it was affirmative of that. But it also made us realize how much we really need to overcome, what really are the obstacles are within these multilateral spaces.
Bringing it back home, how would you rate the youth participation in politics?
In my personal capacity, not under Y20, but just looking at it from what my personal experience was in the Y20, but also being in spaces like the National Dialogue Convention, and just how I've observed how these things tend to go, even, within the African Union, is I often find that, yes, there are changes and there are inclusions of young people within these spaces. But I think what we find is that at the end of the day, there is still youth tokenism. You still have the young person that is the token young person, the trophy that sort of allows for this tick box exercise to say, yeah, we do have young people involved. But you then have to ask yourselves, how involved are these young people? But in the same way, I can also look at South Africa's current government of national unity and how many young MPs we have sitting. I think the youngest MP is still a teenager. I don't know how old she is exactly, but I do know that she's not in her 20s yet. So we do see that, in the government of national unity, which is some sort of reform to our own politics here in South Africa. We won't say how much of a reform it is or what exactly the changes are, but I'm glad to see that we at least do have young people that are now sitting in these spaces that make up the 400 people that are members of parliament.
Having someone in parliament at 18, 19, do you not think that would be a bit premature? That maybe this person should have a bit more expertise, whether it's even experience or education, like that balance? Or is this just a person that's not giving away my age, but heading towards the end of their youth talking?
Well, I mean, there's people who are that's just the youngest person, but it's not to say that all the young people that are currently sitting as MPs, which I don't like talking about domestic politics, particularly South African politics, and I don't think I ever want to find myself directly involved in that, just because of how the system is set up. But there are people that are qualified that, I mean, you're not just put in a position just because you're a young person. There are people that are in their 20s that have had the tertiary education, that are, passing policies that are what I appreciate is the fact that they are our voice as young people. They understand what young people are facing, and sometimes that's all you need. You need to just have somebody that is experiencing what young people are experiencing and can advocate for that plight.
What would have to change in the current political system to encourage greater participation from the likes of yourself?
The whole thing. I think there's something that went wrong probably during CODISA talks. Like we have to go back 30 years, because the way that the system is set up, okay, so it's the closeless proportional representation system, right? And you can see that even when it came to the electoral reform, the easiest path was taken, the path that had the least changes to the system. And I think if we are constantly...
like malicious compliance or something.
Exactly. Because I'm not going to go too much into electoral reform. I think you guys have probably covered that on this podcast before, but it's just like... I don't think proportional representation, or rather closed list proportional representation, is something that actually works for South Africans anymore. And that is purely because of accountability. We are in a system where the people that are in power are not elected into power by the people, by the citizens of the country, but they are elected into power by their parties. And so that means that you are going to be loyal to the hand that feeds you. The way that it is set up is the people that vote are not the ones that feed the people that are in power. It is the people that put them in that power. And so the best thing that I would see is a complete overhaul to the system, like serious systematic reform. That for number one, I'd love to see an open list. Let's start there. Let's actually have an opportunity to see who are the people that are being put on these ballots and how are they being put on those ballots. What is the system, whether it is under a merit system, like what affords these people the opportunity to be on these lists. number one.
Okay.
I'll leave it at that.
But one would assume that all of this is something that would ideally come out as part of the national dialogue, which is something you participated in.
Yes.
What's happening there? So there was a convention, which you did a great job given the circumstances also. I mean, there were issues you dealt with. What happens from there?
Okay, so you had A. Jacobs on the show, who they spoke about what the national dialogue process was like. They spoke about the fact that they had 8 days to actually put together this convention. Now, I came on 5 days prior to the convention taking place. And that was because, so you've already heard the story of how, okay, the foundations are now, there's a hullabaloo. We saw what the media was saying. I was then called by the co-chair of Y20, Mr. Y20, who is also acts under a different organization that had now been brought into the national dialogue process. And so I was just they asked me to come to Kagiso Trust Foundation on a Sunday because they were creating content. They had to start from scratch, from the beginning, to just create content around, okay, what is this thing? And so they called me to just do a video. Like, I was just meant to sit there, record a video with them, just explaining the process, and I was gonna go. When I got there, I then found Tessa Dooms, who I had interacted with, I think for the first time. There was a web series, which was a podcast that I was co-producing with Sportscene and Reebok when I was in high school. And she was a guest on my show then. And so I met her still in my high school days, and we've crossed paths multiple times within these spaces. Yeah, and so she sees me and she's like, "No, man, Lerai, I'm putting together the program for this thing. You can do the presenting thing. I've seen you moderate, like you moderated a conversation that I was a part of. Can you not do the program director thing?" Because they already had brought Teto on board, who is, I think she's a senior political analyst at Eyewitness News, amongst a wide array of other things. And so she said, "I think, Lerai, you can represent the voice of young people, of the people, because what we need in this space is the people. It cannot look like what people are thinking it looks like now, which is, some political thing that is put together by the ANC. That is not what is going on." And so I said, "Okay, what's your budget?" And they said, "There's no budget. We are all performing our civic duty here." I said, "I am 100% on board. Let me lend or volunteer my skills to this process, because I stand for what this process is meant to be. I stand for what we hope to come out of a national dialogue process. But I also know that it is being molded and crafted as the process is unfolding." I mean, 5 days prior, we are still putting together the program. I think by then, UNISA had hopped on and said, "Okay, you guys can use our facilities for free." And so 5 days prior, I am now being brought into what I was seeing happening in the media. And I'm now understanding what actually was taking place behind closed doors. And I said, "Okay."
What?
I mean, Jacob's already okay. Shared
but the
high level understanding. But I think what I was seeing was the fact that there was the issue of the 700 million that was brought up, and people sort of contesting over, okay, where is that money? Where is it? And really understanding that there wasn't actually a 700 million. The 700 million was just an estimate of what this process is going to cost. But then when it came into practice, and really what I understand is there was a lot of ideological differences that took place. But at the end of the day, there was a group of people, a group of organizations, civic people participating in the civic space that were committed to this process that is a national dialogue, and that we're committed to being apolitical throughout that process. And that was something that I said, okay, I want to find myself in it. Because of my experience in all the other spaces that I had been in, even the Y20, I realize and I understand that we are going to have to do this guerrilla style. It is not something that is perfect, that is cut out, that has job descriptions and job roles perfectly outlined. This is something where all of us need to jump on the ship, and we all need to contribute in the way that we can play our part, which meant that you cannot now, or rather you don't have an opportunity to understand what this person is doing in their department, because we all just need to trust that the people that are involved in this do have a level of expertise coming from their own spaces that are coming from, and we are all volunteering our time and our skills to make sure that this is actually seen to fruition. And what the president also was standing his ground on was the fact that this convention cannot be delayed any further. It cannot not happen, because it just needs to start so that they can go into the primary processes. And so 5 days prior, I'm onboarded during the week whilst I'm studying, whilst I'm still doing Y20, whilst I still have my television job. I am, hearing from, okay, this is what's being put on the program, such and such and such. And the way these events go, the program is still being changed 5 minutes before the event starts. And we just need to make sure that as program directors, we make sure that the program goes smoothly and seamlessly, and that all the bolts, the nuts and bolts behind the scenes are not being seen front facing, because this was a big moment for South Africa.
Given the experience with Y20 and also the national dialogue, what hope or disarray do you have of politics and the direction we're heading?
I think it all goes down into the system itself, and it's something that I find that within these spaces we really meander around, but you have to go straight to the bottom. I think we see a lot of things happening from top down, but we really need a bottom up approach, and we need to question and dissect and change the very systems that make up our state, that make up these processes that we find ourselves in. And I say that because I have, as a citizen of South Africa, I think I'm an antithesis to a lot of stereotypes, purely because I have found myself playing in a lot of spaces, or I represent a lot of different constituencies, right? I am a young Black South African woman that can play in the space of entertainment, because I've been in entertainment, that can play in the space of politics purely because I am a student of politics. I am about political education. So not necessarily being in that field, but just sort of understanding what is going on, and to see how can I, as a young person, advocate for what change I want to see. I can also represent, or rather understand the legacies of apartheid within our country when it comes to identity, with things like culture, things like race, and where that leaves someone that is a Black person, using the broad term Black, where that leaves somebody economically within this country, where that leaves someone, and I'm saying this to say that I was raised by a single mother who all she did was work her job and was able to provide for me and put me in a space where I could go to a private school. But that did not necessarily mean that we were middle class in the way that people would picture what middle class is. because of, I think the measurement, the systems of measurement are also quite flawed. And what you find is that the class that I sit under is floating class, because at any moment when that month-to-month salary is taken away, your life is completely changed and you cannot, uphold the lifestyle that you have. And I am also a young person who does not present like they have, been abused in some way. But I've, as a child, had to go through the system, had to go through the criminal justice system after having been abused as a child. And being somebody that was then a statistic and sort of trying to overcome what those statistics were as well, and going against what a 1 in 20 cases being reported was, and having a prosecution which never happens or hardly ever happens, 1 in 20 actually, and only 1 in, okay, I'm being very broad, but I hope that you are understanding and you are following me.
I get the point.
And I've experienced being part of the system. I've experienced the system failing me myself, and that's sort of where also my passion comes from, is to see that there needs to be a change. It doesn't only happen at a policy level, because I think at a policy level, at a lawmaking level, they're doing a good job. But where the change, or rather where the disconnect is the practical implementation of those policies and a constant revisiting of these departments, of these systems, to see what needs to be changed, what's working, what isn't working. I really think that systems need to just regularly have a stop, start, go analysis.
With that said, just a side question from what you were saying. Do you think it's an issue of, largely processes, policies are in place? The personnel, how much of a problem do you think the personnel are in implementation to ensure justice?
The perspective that I look at this from is from a societal level. Because before you are a police officer, before you are a member of parliament, before you're a president, before you're an activist, you are a human being that is a citizen of this country, which means that you have been subjected to legacies of this country, to the legacies of the oppressive systems of this country, and every single human being in this country, whether you are on the privileged side or on the unprivileged side, you've had to experience that. And that means that, and I realize I'm a student, I'm a sponge, I'm curious about everything, and so I'm constantly asking questions about all of this. I realize that power is at the center of it all. And you find that we can have all these conversations about, okay, the change, the system needs to be changed and yada, yada, yada. But really, it's about our people. I don't think the proper care and attention has been put into the people of South Africa. And that's why, something like a national dialogue would be really beautiful to see come into fruition. It's because if we can see that we are the gender-based violence capital of the world, what exactly does that mean? We are in a society where power has been taken away from us 30 years ago, and where power was not equally distributed. And when finally the people that were incredibly oppressed by the system, a system that was created to go against them, those people inherited that same system. There was no change to the system in itself. And so they finally have an opportunity to sit in power. And the power is not then distributed to the rest of the people, or rather, how we view power. And you find it in the way in which crime is committed, you find it in the way in which corruption takes place. It really is all about power. And so I think as a people of South Africa, we really need to have a serious conversation about power over ourselves, over our own agency, over our identities, over our relation with one another. And then it can translate into the roles that we play to make up this society.
I agree fully with what you're saying. And I think speaking on the aspect of the personnel would be to have people that are passionate or public servants or that, want to get the job done. And with that said, linking it to your third pillar, how would you advise youth or anybody, because I guess there's no time in it, how a person finds a crossroads between their passion and their purpose?
I think that's an incredibly big question because it requires people to look within. And it's something that I personally had to struggle with and go through that own journey. It's really about development. And it's about the support that one has to be able to develop as an individual. And it's about the way in which an individual can view their own potential for development. And that then translates to how you see yourself and your position in society, right? For me personally, it came down to understanding what is purpose and understanding that I have a bigger role than myself within the society, that I have been affected by the world. The world has happened to me. Am I then going to be somebody that carries on, that continues what the world does? Or am I going to be somebody that says, no, but this isn't right? It goes down to principles and morals. And so I think really collectively as South African people, we need to understand, or rather just sit down and talk about what are our principles and our morals. Umthetho wethu uthini, right? You go down to the basics of it all. And then you look at yourself as an individual and you say, where do I fit into all of this? How can I contribute in a meaningful way to my community, to my constituency, and to my society? Because we all make up the building blocks of the society. It is not a one-man show. And we really need to then look at ourselves and say, are we respecting the rule of law? Because what I'm seeing right now and the way that it actually goes, the man is the one that is ruling all of it, And so that's what I mean when I say a complete overhauling of systems, because it really requires us to go down to the basics, to strip everything, to strip ourselves of our titles, to strip ourselves of even our own experiences, and to just look at our humanity and what we want to come out of our humanity.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your insights and making time to walk us through not only your story, but that of the Y20 and the National Dialogue, which still has, it's supposed to take some time here. It's supposed to take like a year, National Dialogue.
So the phase that they're in right now is that primary phase, which is sort of testing and figuring out whether or not these processes work. It's supposed to be about 6 to 9 months, the whole process in itself. So that means that this time next year, there should be a People's Compact, but also something else other than just the People's Compact that comes out.
Okay, we'll bring you back. But guys, thank you again. Thank you for tuning in. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, share on all platforms, including hers, which we'll share. I mean, you're on Instagram, YouTube, so everywhere. Like, subscribe, share, and tune in. Palatable Politics.